every own. Until what if I told you the greatest revolution of our time didn't happen with tanks, missiles, or blood? It happened silently, invisibly in people's minds, and no one in the West saw it coming. Just one ordinary day, India stopped asking for permission. That was the day the West lost control over India. Forever, for decades, India was seen as the land of potential, a place could outsource labor to export products, to lecture on democracy and exploit for cheap brains. But here's what the West didn't expect. India woke up. It wasn't some political campaign or flashy announcement. It wasn't even about war or peace. It was a shift in energy, collective click in the minds of a billion people. India stopped chasing approval. India stopped explaining itself. India stopped playing second. India started leading. You see, the real chains the West had on India weren't military, they were mental. They made India question its value, its history, its identity. They made us think success needed a British accent or a Western passport. Oh, it broke LWD. Suddenly, Indian engineers weren't just workers, they were CEO of global companies. Suddenly, Indian tragic, they were cool, influential, marketable. Suddenly, the merging market wasn't emerging anymore, it was dominating in the West. They were still using the old playbook. They thought they could still shape the narrative. But India had Wi-Fi, smartphones, and opinions. Now opinions that went viral, opinions that became policy, opinions that said, "We're not waiting anymore." And here's the truth the West never wanted to admit. They didn't give India its rise that day. The day India mentally divorced from dependency, that day wasn't announced. There were no headlines, no parades, but 0, 0, 0, 1, 32. If you were paying attention, you felt it in the way Indians started building themselves, in the way they chose local over foreign, in the way they said, "We're not your market or your competition." That day the West didn't lose India physically, they lost control mentally. And once you lose someone's mind, you lose them forever. The future doesn't belong to the powerful, it belongs to the self-aware. And India, finally, for decades, the dominance of the West was seen as a fixed law of the global order, as if history had gifted them permanent superiority over the rest of the world. This illusion of permanence was crafted not just through colonial conquests or technological leaps, but through deep-rooted psychological influence that stretched across continents and generations. When in 1947, many thought the exit marked the end of direct rule, but the invisible chains of Western control stayed tightly wrapped around Indian systems, its economy, its education, its foreign policy, even the way Indians viewed their own worth. English became more than a language, it was a gatekeeper to power. Western approval became the stamp of success. Indian leaders, thinkers, and entrepreneurs were measured by how well they aligned with foreign ideals rather than their own cultural roots. The West positioned itself as the ultimate validator. If a book won a Western prize, it mattered. If a startup gained Silicon Valley's funding, it was credible. If a film made it to a European festival, was art. This grip was subtle, but suffocating. What was missed in this narrative was that the West's dominance was never written in stone. It was a combination of timing, aggression, manipulation, and opportunity. India was never inferior, it was interrupted from ancient times. India had been a nucleus of science, medicine, 0, 0, 0, 3, 0, 2, spirituality, architectmatics, and philosophy, the decimal system, Ayurveda, yoga, metallurgy, astronomy, all born from Indian soil long before any European enlightenment. The British and later the broad West didn't bring civilization to India, they tried to bury it under their own definitions of progress. But history moves in cycles, is always temporary. As India's population surged with younger generations, tech-savvy, globally connected, the no longer mentally colonized began to unravel. Indian engineers no longer saw working for a Western company as the pinnacle. They began building their own. Indian filmmakers stopped chasing international awards and made movies that spoke to the heart of their people. Indian politicians, once eager for foreign photo ops, started forming independent global alliances. The pandemic further accelerated this mindset shift. When supply chains collapsed and Western systems buckled, India not only survived sending vaccines abroad and digitizing its economy faster than most of the West, once the world's loudest voice was now competing for relevance in rooms where it used to dictate terms. The idea that the West would forever lead, forever define modernity, forever shaped global policy began to crumble under the sheer weight of new realities for India. The old craving for validation has been replaced by a calm confidence. The currency of influence is no longer held exclusively in Washington or London. It's shared across time zones, with Delhi, Bengaluru, and Mumbai now sitting the table as equals, not as silent guests. Cultural narratives are shifting, and the global South is no longer waiting for permission to speak. The irony is that the West's grip didn't loosen. It loosened because India stopped holding 000433. Its breath stopped waiting and started walking on its own terms without looking back or needing to be led by anyone else, because the story the West told was never permanent, and the belief in their eternal grip was the last chain to be broken once and for all. When India remembered who it truly was before it was told who to be by anyone else, the most profound revolutions don't start on battlefields, they begin in the mind, and that's exactly what happened when India underwent a psychological shift that rewired its relationship with the West, and more importantly with itself. For decades after independence, the subconscious of the Indian population was still shackled to colonial ideas of worth, intelligence, and modernity. English wasn't just a language, it was a symbol of class. White skin was just another skin tone. It was still somehow aspirational. Foreigners were seen as superior, Western approval as essential, and local innovation as second. This wasn't a flaw in character. It was a result of years of engineered inferiority installed through policies, education systems, and narratives that repeatedly told Indians that greatness existed elsewhere, never within. But slowly, quietly, and irreversibly, that mental framework began to crack. A new generation started asking uncomfortable questions. Why is a British accent still more respected than a regional Indian one? Why do we glorify imported goods when our own manufacturing power is growing? Why do we need validation from global institutions that once denied our very humanity? These weren't rhetorical queries, they were psychological landmines, and they detonated in classrooms, boardrooms, living rooms, and online forums across the country. The internet acted as a catalyst. Social media connected people, ideas, and voices across regions, and castes. The youth of India no longer waited for Western media 000604 to define who they were. They began defining themselves. They created content in their own languages, told stories from their own cultures, built apps, wrote books, launched businesses, not with the aim to impress the West, but to empower their own. Even the way success was measured changed a generation ago. Making it meant moving to the US. Today, making in building something in India that the world can't ignore. The pride in being Indian was no longer rooted in nostalgia or emotional patriotism. It was becoming logical, crack, and evidence based. People started pointing to Indian innovations, Indian space missions, Indian CEO, Indian philosophies, and Indian resilience. They began to realize that the West didn't gift India modernity, it paused its continuity. Once that realization took root, it triggered a chain reaction. Parents started encouraging their children to embrace Indian names, culture, and roots. Educational institutions began reevaluating Eurocentric curricula. Political discourse turned more inward looking and assertive, and most importantly, average Indian no longer felt the need to apologize for being who they are. The deep-seated colonial hangover that once made Indians defer to foreign judgment started to clear. National confidence became less about slogans and more about unshakable identity. The psychological shift wasn't loud, but it was massive. It moved through generations like a quiet storm, reshaping how people saw themselves and their country. This wasn't about nationalism. It was about neutralizing the centuries-old idea that India always had to catch up, because when a billion people stop seeing themselves as behind and start seeing themselves as central, the global power equation is forced to adjust. This shift wasn't handed over by any foreign power, and it wasn't fueled by anger or revenge. It was born from 000736 self-recognition, from a sudden collective realization that India had always been enough and it never needed to borrow pride, progress, or purpose from any other civilization, only to remember that truth. And once it did, nothing was ever going to feel the same again, because the real freedom was never just political. It was always mental, and once that clicked, the illusion of inferiority shattered beyond repair, and nothing could ever return to the way it was before. The digital awakening in India wasn't just a technological upgrade. It was a cultural, social, and psychological revolution that leveled the global playing field. Without a single shot being fired for decades, the West dominated the narrative simply because it controlled the platforms, the press, and the pipelines of global communication. It decided what stories were told, whose voices mattered, and what was considered newsworthy. But with the explosion of internet access, smartphones, especially after the launch of initiatives like Digital India and the entry of low-cost data providers, suddenly a billion people got a microphone. Suddenly the village teacher had the same access to information as a professor in Boston. Suddenly the student Bahar could code, collaborate, and compete with someone in Berlin. Suddenly Indian creators weren't mimicking global trends, they were setting them. And this shift wasn't just about content consumption, it was about content creation, content control, and content confidence. Platforms like YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and countless Indian startups gave voice to the unheard and power to the underestimated. The stories that were once erased, ignored, or reshaped by Western filters were now being told directly from the source in raw accents in local languages. And farmers live-streamed protests, small businesses went 00, 09, 07 global through reels, artists shared their craft without middlemen, and thinkers challenged colonial narratives using nothing more than a camera and courage. The world could no longer pretend not to see India, because India was everywhere, trending, tweeting, teaching, and telling truths that were long buried under centuries of cultural smog. For the first time, the average Indian didn't need to go abroad to be heard, they just needed wife. But more than reach, it was the mindset that shifted. The idea that power belonged to someone else, that influence came from the West, that validation had to be imported. Those beliefs began to crumble as India's digital presence exploded. Innovation was no longer gated by geography. People started building startups from one room, learning AI from YouTube tutorials, pitching to global investors from Tier 2 towns, and forming communities around ideas, not just identities. The smartphone became a classroom, a protest site, a stage, a shop, and a battlefield of ideas. The Western monopoly on influence, information, and imagination was broken by millions of Indian fingers tapping out thoughts, questions, critiques, and visions for the future. Even government and governance evolved in response to this awakening. Policies, debates, and decisions were suddenly under the microscope of an informed, vocal, and fearless online citizenry. The elites who once shaped opinion from ivory towers were now being challenged by viral threads from 19-year-olds in small towns. Legacy media no longer dictated the mood. Memes, videos, and reels did, and it all this digital noise, a deeper signal emerged. India had found its voice, and it wasn't asking for a seat at the table anymore. It was designing a new table altogether. The West could no longer define India by outdated stereotypes when Indians were defining themselves every second in 00, 10, 37, every post in every language and in every dialect, reshaping global perception without permission. And all it took was one connection, one phone, and the courage to speak without waiting to be spoken to. Because the power didn't shift when India got online, it shifted when India realized it no longer needed to log into someone else's version of the world to make its own real and visible to everyone else. Economic independence over dependence was never just about trade balances or foreign investments. It was about reclaiming control over destiny, about shifting from being a market for others to being a maker for oneself. For far too long, India's role in the global economy was boxed into convenient categories designed by others: the back office of the world, the land of cheap labor, the destination for outsourcing, or the importer of Western luxuries. The West had grown used to a compliant India, one that looked outward for solutions, borrowed models for development, waited for foreign funds, and saw multinationals as messiahs. But that model began a collapse, not with a bang, but with a mindset. Economic independence in the Indian context wasn't born in boardrooms. It started on the ground, in the ambition of everyday citizens who began to trust in their ability to build, innovate, and solve problems without waiting for external rescue. The startup boom didn't come from copying Silicon Valley. It emerged from the gritty reality of Indian life, from Tier 2 towns where young minds built fintech solutions, ag tools and tech platforms, and health tech systems to meet local needs with global impact. The moment Indians stopped seeing foreign brands as symbols of prestige and began investing in their own homegrown companies, the axis of power began to tilt. It wasn't protectionism, it was pragmatism. It wasn't nationalism when global supply 001208 chains broke. India became a manufacturer. When big tech dominated narratives, India created its own digital infrastructure. When pharma giants held the world hostage, India became the vaccine pharmacy of the globe. All of this wasn't accidental. It was intentional, strategic, and born from a realization that dependence is just a disguised form of control. The shift to self-reliance wasn't a rejection of globalization. It was a redefinition of it. India gained to engage with the world not as a passive participant, but as a proactive architect of its economic future. Foreign direct investment was no longer about bowing to multinationals. It was about partnerships on Indian terms. Trade agreements were no longer accepted blindly. They were negotiated with confidence. Even the idea of making India was not just a slogan, it was a declaration of dignity. The psychological emancipation from Western economic dominance happened when India realized it didn't have to be grateful for every foreign plant set up on its soil, but could instead build its own ecosystems, become an exporter of both goods and ideas. The global shift toward multipolarity gave India the perfect storm to rise: cheaper tech, youth, demographics, political will, and a public that had be demand quality from within, not just chase labels from abroad. Every Indian product that replaced an import, every rupee saved in manufacturing, every innovation tailored for Indian conditions became a step toward independence. But more importantly, every time India said no to an unfair deal, walked away from a lopsided agreement, or refused to compromise its interest for international applause, it proved that economic independence wasn't about isolation. It was about respect, leverage, and courage to stand on one's feet without being dictated to by those who 001338 once profited off dependence disguised as development. And that courage was no longer rare. It was rising in every sector, in every investor pitch, in every export number, and in every policy decision, led not by desperation, but by deliberate, determined sovereignty that no longer begged to be included because it had already begun building its own center of gravity. Cultural reclamation in India was never about nostalgia. It was about justice, about returning what was taken, hidden, or diluted under centuries of foreign rule. Academic rewriting and elitist shame for far too long. Indian culture was filtered through a Western lens that exoticized its rituals, ridiculed its beliefs, sanitized its spirituality, and commodified its practices. What was sacred was labeled superstition. What was complex was called primitive. What was ancient was deemed obsolete. Even worse, many Indians internalized these labels. English-speaking urban elites laughed at Sanskrit, mocked Vedic wisdom from fashion to food to family systems, while sidelining their own rich cultural inheritance as backward or embarrassing. But then something shifted. Quietly at first, Indians began rediscovering what had always been theirs. The youth, ironically through modern tools like podcasts, YouTube, and social media, began diving into the roots that textbooks had ignored. They started asking why yoga was more respected abroad than at home, why Ayurveda was treated like alternative medicine in the West, but dismissed in its birthplace, why Indian temples showcase mathematical genius yet weren't taught in school curricula. This was not a government policy. It was a psychological renaissance when Indian fashion began to embrace series Judas and Patti with pride, when Bollywood movies started celebrating festivals without disclaimers, when ancient texts 001509 were being read not with blind faith but critical curiosity. It marked a return to the South, not a retreat from modernity. Cultural reclamation wasn't just about the old, it was about blending timeless wisdom with present relevance. Youngers launched startups rooted in Indian traditions, organic skincare based on Ayurvedic recipes, mindful apps inspired by Diana tea brands that told the story of Assam and Darjeeling in Indian voices, not British advertisements. Too became a battleground Revival regional languages started booming online, memes, music, storytelling all began flourishing in Tamil, Marathi, Telugu, BJ, Guri, Punjabi, Malayalam, and more, breaking the false hierarchy that had once placed English at the top, and everything else beneath. This was not isolationist pride. The shame that had been implanted by colonizers and reinforced by generations of systemic dismissal began to dissolve. Even the diaspora, once copying two worlds, began returning to their roots with curiosity. Instead of confusion, temples weren't just places of worship, they were seen as archives of architecture, acoustics, astronomy, and social systems. Folk art wasn't just decoration, it was a living legacy. Epics weren't just stories, they were psychological blueprints that explored ethics, duty, emotion, and identity in ways the West had only begun to scratch. And as this cultural reclamation spread, the world started noticing, not as cultural appropriation, but as cultural assertion. India was no longer apologizing for its culture. It was celebrating it, exporting, and educating others on its depth. The West, once amused by Indian culture as of colorful curiosity, began to see it as a serious, sophisticated civilization that had influenced humanity far beyond curry and karma. This shift didn't need approval, it carried its own authority. 1641 Global respect earned, not given, is the quiet but thunderous shift that India has undergone in the last few decades, a shift that didn't come through charity, pity, or inherited power, but through relentless effort, strategic resilience, and undeniable presence. For years, India was spoken about in global forums with a tone that mixed condescension and cautious optimism, often boxed into phrases like developing nation, third world country, or emerging marvels, that conveniently placed India in a permanent state of becoming but never quite arriving. The West spoke in a fixed guide or manage, but never as a peer. That tone didn't change with words, it changed when India showed up repeatedly in places where it wasn't expected to lead. It changed when Indian scientists launched a mission to Mars for less money than it took Hollywood to make a space movie. It changed when Indian companies began acquiring global giants. Not changed when Indian origin leaders, thinkers, CEO, and innovators began rising to the top, not just abroad, but also transforming institutions from within. It changed when India stopped pleading for attention and began commanding it. From pharmaceuticals to fintech, from renewable energy to AI, India's contributions started speaking louder than its critics. Respect wasn't requested in diplomatic language, it was earned in numbers, in breakthroughs, in solutions delivered under pressure. The global South began to see India not just as a country, but as a model, imperfect, yes, but powerful in its potential and consistent in its trajectory. During the pandemic, when many powerful nations struggled to maintain supply chains, healthcare systems, and social cohesion, India not only managed to vaccinate one of the largest populations on Earth, but also exported vaccines to dozens of 12 countries, many of which had long been forgotten by global powers. That generosity wasn't just aid, it was strategy wrapped in humanity. It showed the world that leadership isn't just about GDP, it's about who shows up when others don't. And while old powers held on a cold diplomacy, India used soft power like a scalpel through yoga, cinema, cuisine, technology, and fell offing itself in the global consciousness, not by force but by frequency. Indian culture, once more misunderstood, began showing up in boardrooms, classrooms, and studios across the globe. Indian ideas on mindfulness and wellness became billion-dollar industries. Indian innovation began solving global problems, not just national ones. But respect isn't just cultural, it's geopolitical. Once treated like a pawn in the global chessboard, began acting like a player, balancing relationships with US, China, Europe, and the Middle East on its own terms. It refused to be boxed into alliances that didn't serve its interests. It began hosting some. It's setting agendas, leading climate talks, building digital infrastructure that even the West began to study. And what rattled many was not just that India had grown powerful, but that it had done so without mimicking Western behavior. It collaborated, it didn't preach, it performed, it didn't demanded. The West had grown used to nations seeking it approval, but India wasn't waiting for applause. It was too busy building, healing, teaching, and leading with a calm conviction that respect doesn't come from titles or treaties. It comes from being impossible to ignore, from turning every doubt, every failure into fuel, and every insult into initiative that rewrites the rules of global relevance on its own page, in its own ink, with its own hand, that never 1944 asked for permission to rise, but simply did because it had already earned the right to be seen, heard, and respected on its own terms, without waiting for anyone to validate what it knew to be true all along. And narrative power reversed is perhaps one of the most underestimated revolutions that India has undergone, a quiet insurgency, not of weapons or wealth, but of voice, visibility, and veracity. For centuries, India's story was told by others: colonial administrators, Western historians, global thanks, all of whom saw India through a narrow, curated, often condescending lens. Poverty was amplified while progress was edited out. Spirituality was romanticized while science was dismissed. Every Indian achievement was either downplayed or framed as an anomaly, while every challenge was held up as a national identity. The world didn't know India, it knew what the West told it about India. But slowly that monopoly over narrative began to crack. The internet broke open the gates of perception. Social media dismantled editorial walls, and Indian voices, once marginalized or forced into Western vocabulary, began telling stories in their own accents, on their own platforms, with their own lenses. For the first time, India didn't need foreign filmmakers to explain its poverty. It had creators showing prosperity. It didn't need Western anchors to describe its elections. It had local voices live streaming democracy in action. Didn't need foreign scholars interpreting Sanskrit or the Vedas. It had Indian minds decoding their own heritage. Every viral video, every trending hashtag, every meme in a regional language became a brick in a new narrative fortress that didn't seek validation from old power centers. The reversal wasn't aggressive, it was assertive. It didn't shout, it simply didn't shut up anymore. It reclaimed the right to define, describe, 21, 15, and disseminate its own identity without apology or abbreviation. Indian Sims stopped pandering to Western tastes and began celebrating its own roots unapologetically. Indian historians challenged the colonial versions of events with research, data, and clarity. Indian entrepreneurs began to share their startup journeys in Hindi, Tamil, not just in polished, westernized English, reaching millions who had always been left out of economic conversation. And perhaps most powerfully, Indian culture stopped being something to escape from and became something to export with pride. Yoga was no longer just a global fitness trend, it was recognized as a civilizational gift. Indian festivals were no longer colorful distractions, they were recognized as profound expressions of philosophy, community, and time. Bollywood began influencing global fashion and music, not by copying the West, but by boldly being itself. The storytelling that had once belonged to colonial pens and foreign microphone to the hands of Indians with cameras, phones, podcasts, and platforms that didn't need a Western filter to be impactful. When it no longer only saw slums, it saw satellites, startups, sustainable models of innovation, spiritual depth, street smart youth, and a political discourse that, while messy, was undeniably alive. The shift in narrative power didn't come from confrontation, it came from consistency, by showing up again and again with stories that mattered, with facts that corrected distortions, and with confidence that didn't need translation. India flipped the script. It refused to be a supporting character in someone else's drama, and took back the role of narrator, director, and protagonist in its own ongoing epic that no longer sought to fit into the chapters written by others, but began publishing its own volumes with boldness. 22, 46 honesty, and a refusal to be boxed in by outdated stereotypes, because when you own the narrative, you own the memory, the meaning, and the momentum that shapes how the world sees you and how you see yourself, without having to ask for permission or approval ever again. Geostrategic boldness was never about military might alone, it was about the courage to chart one's own course in a world that constantly demands alignment. For decades, India was expected to play by the script handed to it, either toe the line of the West or drift into the orbit of other global powers. But India, with its ancient civilization and modern aspirations, chose a third path: strategic autonomy. It was calculated independence, India began engaging with the world not from a position of dependency, but with a quiet assertion that it would make decisions based on national interest, not international pressure. When global powers picked sides in conflicts, India maintained diplomatic balance when alliances formed. With the intention of isolating others, India chose dialogue over division. It purchased defense equipment from Russia while deepening strategic ties with the United States. It participated in the Quad while maintaining cordial relations with China. It stood with the global South while building partnerships in the global North. This multi-vector approach confused many who were used to simpler binary loyalties. But for India, it was not about being uncompromised. It recognized that the future of geopolitics wasn't East versus West, it was fluid, layered, and fiercely self-interested, and India had both the wisdom and the will to navigate that complexity. The old days of begging for inclusion at high tables were over. Now India was hosting those very tables, bringing together leaders and shaping agendas on everything from climate 24/17 change to technology to counter-terrorism. Its foreign policy was no longer a reaction to global events, it was proactive, long-term, and deeply informed by its unique geography, demography, and historical experiments. Act East policy to its look West engagement, from forging maritime alliances in the Indo-Pacific to energy partnerships with the Gulf. India transformed itself from a regional actor into a global influencer. Its military exercises began including both Eastern and Western powers. Its defense doctrine shifted from restraint to readiness, and its space program, once mocked, became a symbol of soft power and strategic capability. But perhaps most significant was India's response to pressure. When the world tried to corner it on trade, defense, or diplomatic positions, India didn't bend. And when explanations weren't enough, it simply moved forward, whether abstaining from UN votes or pushing back against global narratives. India showed that non-alignment in today's terms didn't mean being undecided. It meant being deeply decided on protecting sovereignty above all else. That boldness didn't come from arrogance. It came from a long memory and a clear vision. It came from knowing that being used as a pawn in other people's conflicts never leads to respect. It came from understanding that real influence comes not from siding with power, but from becoming powerful enough to sit across from it, negotiate with it, and walk away from it when needed. The world once used to an India that was hesitant is now encountering an India that is firm, agile, and deeply strategic in how it engages defense, alliance, and disagrees, because this new posture is not built on reaction, it's built on resilience, geography, legacy, and a growing sense that India is no longer the subject of global decisions made elsewhere, but a sovereign voice writing 00/25/48 its own doctrine with confidence that cannot be shaken by diplomacy, dressed as dominance or alliances disguised as obligations. It wasn't a day on the calendar. It was a day in the Mar, a moment that didn't come with fanfare or flags, but arrived quietly deep within the consciousness of a nation that had been underestimated for too long. There was no official declaration, no public holiday, no commemorative speech. It was something more profound, something invisible yet irreversible. It was the collective realization that the leash of dependency had been mental all along, and the power to remove it never required anyone's permission. For decades, India's relationship with the West had been one of polite subservience, a dance between admiration and quiet resentment. Progress, Western models shaped development, and Western narratives told India's story. And while independence in 1947 was marked by speeches, documents, and decolonization, the deeper colonization took longer to confront. But that confrontation came not all at once, but in ripples that turned into waves. It came when Indian youth stopped idolizing foreign universities as the only path to success. It came when Indian entrepreneurs stopped chasing Silicon Valley exits and started building unicorns at home. It came when a generation no longer flinched at speaking in their mother tongues, wearing their culture on their sleeves, or defending their beliefs without the need to westernize their vocabulary. It came when success was no longer measured by proximity to the West, but by impact within and beyond the borders of India. This mental shift wasn't just about pride, it was about clarity. India didn't need to mimic the West to modernize. It could borrow tools without borrowing identities. It could collaborate without conforming. And as the nation grew more 00/27/20 20 self-assured, the West began to respond differently, not because India asked, but because India had changed the rules of the engagement. Global platforms began taking Indian issues seriously, not out of charity, but out of necessity. International corporations started adjusting to Indian demands, not to be generous, but to stay relevant. Indian art ideas and innovation were no longer seen as quirky add-ons, but as core contributions, and still this transformation wasn't marked by any calendar date. There was no external stamp of acknowledgement, because the shift that mattered most was internal, the quiet but seismic moment, when a critical mass of Indians began thinking differently about themselves, their nation, and their place in the world. It was in that moment that the West's control dissolved, not through treaty sanctions or speeches, but because its grip on Indian perception no longer held. The chains weren't broken in public, they were outgrown in private, and once a mind has tasted sovereignty, no force on earth can recolonize it. That day, the day the West lost control, wasn't written into history books, but it lives in the daily choices of a billion people who have stopped looking up and started looking forward, walking into the future, not as shadows of another empire, but as architects of their own, because the day the mind wakes up, the world takes notice, and India is wide awake.